John Miller, a man who had survived the battlefields of Afghanistan, sought peace in a place forgotten by time, a decaying manor in the Vermont wilderness. His only companion was Ace, a German shepherd whose calm demeanor had been forged in the chaos of combat. Ace was a rock, a silent testament to discipline and control. But deep beneath the house, in the cold, damp dark of the cellar, that control shattered. The dog, ignoring the scent of rot and ruin, became fixated on a solid wall of ancient stone. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound of profound distress John had never heard before. Then he began to dig, his powerful claws scraping frantically against the unyielding stone, his entire body trembling with a desperate urgency.
What is it, boy?
John watched, his blood running cold. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence of the Vermont woods was a heavy blanket, thick and comforting. For John Miller, it was the only medicine that truly worked. Here, under the canopy of ancient maples and whispering pines, the ghosts of the past seemed to stay at a respectful distance. His small, secluded cabin was more than a home. It was a fortress against a world that had become too loud, too fast, too full of things he was trying to forget. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, casting a warm orange light across the rustic room. John lay on a simple cot, his breathing shallow and uneven. He was a man carved from hardship, tall and lean with a strength that was more wiry than bulky. His short brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, a premature testament to a life lived on the edge. A thick, neatly trimmed beard and stubble covered a face that was weathered and kind, though his blue eyes often held a distant, haunted look. Even in sleep, his body was tense, a coiled spring ready to snap. The dream came as it always did, not as a story, but as a chaotic storm of sensation. The oppressive heat of the sun, the grit of sand in his teeth, the deafening roar of an explosion that seemed to suck the air from his lungs. Shouts in a language he understood and another he didn't. The smell of dust and something acrid, something final. He was running, his rifle heavy in his hands, but his boots felt like they were filled with lead. A low whine cut through the noise, a sound that didn't belong in the desert landscape of his memory. It was soft, insistent. Then a wet nose nudged his hand, followed by a warm, heavy head resting on his chest. John's eyes flew open. He gasped, the phantom smell of smoke still clinging to the back of his throat. The cabin was dark, safe. The only sound was the gentle crackle of the embers and the steady, comforting breathing of the animal on top of him. He looked down into a pair of intelligent amber eyes. "Easy, boy," John whispered, his voice hoarse. Ace, a magnificent German shepherd of about 6, shifted his weight but didn't move. His thick coat, a rare and beautiful mix of wolf gray and white, was soft under John's trembling hand. He was more than a dog. He was a living, breathing anchor to the present. He had been with John for 5 years, a 4-legged therapist who worked for kibble and affection. Ace seemed to possess an uncanny understanding of the invisible wounds John carried, knowing exactly when to apply the gentle pressure of his presence to chase the nightmares away. John stroked the dog's broad head, his own heart rate slowly returning to normal. "Thanks, pal. I'm okay." Ace seemed to accept this, letting out a soft huff before gracefully hopping off the cot. He settled onto his own bed by the fire, but his eyes remained fixed on John, a silent, vigilant guardian. Morning arrived with a cool, crisp light filtering through the trees. John, now dressed in his usual uniform of a faded blue plaid shirt over a gray t-shirt, worn denim jeans, and sturdy work boots, went about his routine with an economy of movement that spoke of his military training. He made coffee, shared a piece of toast with Ace, and then they headed out for their morning walk. The dirt road leading from his cabin was long and winding. At its end stood a solitary rustic mailbox. It was a trip he made only twice a week. He preferred as little contact with the outside world as possible. Most days the box was empty, save for the occasional flyer. But today a crisp, cream-colored envelope sat inside. It felt unnervingly formal. He carried it back to the cabin, turning it over in his hands. The return address was a law firm in Burlington. John's brow furrowed. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have dealings that required one. Sitting at his simple wooden table, he slit the envelope open with his pocket knife. Ace lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws, watching. The letter was brief and formal, its language cold and precise. It informed him of the passing of his great-uncle, Augustus Miller, a man John had met maybe a handful of times in his entire life. He felt a distant, muted sense of loss. Augustus had been the black sheep of the family, or rather, the gray sheep. He wasn't loud or boisterous like John's father and other uncles. He was a quiet academic man who always seemed more comfortable with a book than a conversation. John remembered him from childhood family gatherings as a figure who hovered at the edges, his eyes kind, but his presence fleeting. But it was the next paragraph that made John's hand pause. According to the will, Augustus had left his entire estate to John. The estate consisted of a single property, Blackwood Manor, located in a remote corner of Vermont. A humorless laugh escaped John's lips. A manor. What was he supposed to do with a manor? He could barely manage his small cabin. It had to be a mistake, or worse, a burden. He imagined a crumbling, debt-ridden house that would swallow what little savings he had. It was a complication, an unwelcome intrusion into the fragile peace he had so carefully constructed. He crumpled the letter in his fist, the paper crackling in protest. His first instinct was to call the lawyer, a Mr. Davies according to the letterhead, and tell him to sell it, donate the proceeds, do whatever he wanted with it. John didn't want it. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the familiar, unchanging woods. He had come here after his final tour, after the doctors had given his condition a name, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a handful of pills that only seemed to dull the world. The woods and Ace had been his real prescription. He felt a soft nudge against his leg. Ace looked up at him, then glanced down at the crumpled ball of paper in John's hand. The dog let out a low whine, a sound of gentle inquiry. "It's nothing, boy," John said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ace wasn't convinced. He nudged John's hand again, this time with more purpose, his nose touching the letter. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound. In his self-imposed isolation, John had forgotten what it felt like to have a responsibility to anyone but his dog. This letter, this inheritance, felt like a chain pulling him back toward a world he had tried to leave behind. He looked down at Ace, at the unwavering loyalty in the dog's eyes. He thought of his uncle, the quiet man with the books. Why him? Why leave such a thing to a nephew he barely knew? Slowly, John unclenched his fist and smoothed the wrinkled paper on the table. He read it again. Blackwood Manor. There was a sense of finality to it, a loose end from a family he had drifted away from. Perhaps ignoring it would be a disservice not just to his uncle's memory, but to the faint sense of duty that still flickered within him. He could go, see the place for himself. It would be one last trip, a final mission to close a chapter he never even knew was open. He would assess the property, sign whatever papers were necessary, and authorize its sale. Then he and Ace could return to their quiet life, their fortress in the woods, with no lingering questions. A small smile touched John's lips for the first time that day. He reached down and scratched Ace behind the ears, hitting the spot that made the dog's leg thump against the wooden floor. "What do you think, boy?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Feel like a road trip?" Ace responded with an enthusiastic bark, his tail thumping a happy rhythm. It was settled. For the first time in years, John Miller had a mission. He and Ace were going to see about a manor. The journey north took them through the heart of Vermont's Green Mountains. John's old pickup truck, a machine as reliable and weathered as he was, ate up the miles with a steady rumble. Ace sat proudly in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind, a look of pure bliss on his face. For him, this was the grandest of adventures. For John, it felt more like a retreat into a past he had never been a part of. As the truck climbed higher, the landscape transformed. Quaint towns with white-steepled churches gave way to winding roads flanked by dense forests of birch and fir. The vibrant colors of late autumn painted the hillsides in strokes of gold, crimson, and burnt orange. It was a beautiful, lonely country. The farther they drove, the more the quiet of the wilderness began to feel familiar, a larger version of the sanctuary he had built for himself. With the miles, memories of his great-uncle Augustus surfaced, fragmented and hazy like old photographs. John remembered a family barbecue sometime in the late 1990s. His father and other uncles, all loud, hearty men, were gathered around a grill, their laughter booming across the yard. And there was Augustus, standing apart under the shade of a large oak tree, smoking a pipe and reading a leather-bound book. He had looked up and caught John's eye, a small, gentle smile touching his lips before he returned to his reading. He smelled of old paper and sweet pipe tobacco, a scent completely alien in a family that smelled of sawdust and engine oil, another memory from a Christmas Eve years later. Augustus had given him a book, a collection of classic adventure stories. "A mind needs a map, John," he'd said, his voice soft but clear. "Books are the best maps of all." John's father had clapped him on the back a moment later, joking about how Augustus was trying to turn him into a scholar. John still had the book, tucked away in a footlocker with other relics of his life before the army. Augustus was an island of quiet contemplation in an ocean of familial noise. He was different, and in a family that valued conformity, different was often mistaken for distant. John realized now, with a pang of regret, that he had never tried to bridge that distance. After nearly 3 hours of driving, the directions from the lawyer led them off the main highway and onto a series of smaller, less maintained country roads. The pavement eventually gave way to gravel, and the gravel to a rutted dirt track that was barely wide enough for the truck. The trees closed in around them, their branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers. Finally, they saw it. 2 massive stone pillars, green with moss and age, flanked a pair of wrought iron gates that had long ago sagged open in a permanent, weary welcome. Beyond the gates, a driveway, almost completely reclaimed by nature, disappeared into the shadows of the woods. This was the entrance to Blackwood Manor. John steered the truck through the gates, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. The driveway wound through the trees for another quarter-mile before opening into a large, circular clearing. And there it stood. Blackwood Manor was not just a house, it was a monument to a forgotten time. Built from large, dark stones, it rose 3 stories high, its facade partially covered in a thick blanket of ivy. Multiple gables and a single, lonely turret pointed toward the gray sky. The windows, many of them broken, stared out like vacant eyes. It was magnificent and heartbreakingly sad all at once. A sleeping giant that had been left to the mercy of time and the elements. John parked the truck and cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Well, boy," John said softly, his eyes scanning the imposing structure. "There she is." Ace let out a low whine, his excitement from the car ride replaced by a cautious curiosity. John got out, his boots landing softly on the mossy ground. As he stretched his stiff muscles, Ace hopped down from the passenger side, his paws silent. The dog began to sniff the air, his body language changing. His ears were perked, his tail low and still. He trotted a few paces ahead and stopped, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. He wasn't looking at the house, but at a thick cluster of overgrown rhododendron bushes off to the side of the driveway. John's training took over instantly. He didn't call out or dismiss the dog's warning. He trusted Ace's instincts more than his own. His posture shifted, becoming less relaxed and more alert. He scanned the area around the bushes, his eyes methodically sweeping from left to right. At first he saw nothing but tangled branches and a carpet of dead leaves. But then he spotted them, subtle signs, invisible to the untrained eye. Near the edge of the bushes, the leaves were disturbed, pressed down in a way that suggested a vehicle had recently pulled off the drive. He walked closer, his steps careful. There, partially obscured, was the distinct fresh track of a heavy-duty tire, the kind found on an expensive SUV or truck. It hadn't been there long. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by wind or rain. A few feet away, something glinted in the pale afternoon light. John knelt down. It was a cigarette butt, the filter still clean and white. It wasn't a brand he smoked. It was a small thing, a piece of trash, but here, in this isolated place, it was a signal. They were not alone. Or at least someone had been here very, very recently. Someone was watching this place. "Good boy, Ace," John murmured, giving the dog a reassuring pat. The growl subsided, but Ace remained watchful, staying close to John's side. The initial mission, to simply see the place and leave, had just become more complicated. With a newfound sense of caution, John approached the massive oak front door. The ornate key the lawyer had sent him slid into the lock with a rusty shriek, and the heavy door swung inward on groaning hinges, opening into a grand, dusty foyer. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp stone, decaying wood, and time itself. Sunlight streamed through a grimy Palladian window above the door, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. A grand staircase with a beautifully carved banister, now draped in cobwebs, curved up into the shadows of the second floor. Furniture stood like shrouded ghosts under white dust cloths. They spent the next hour exploring. Each room told a story of faded grandeur. A library with empty shelves, a ballroom with a floor warped by moisture, a dining room where a long, ghostly table waited for guests who would never arrive. Finally, they made their way to a heavy wooden door that led down to the cellar. The stone steps were steep and slick with dampness. John used the flashlight from his truck to pierce the oppressive darkness below. The basement was a labyrinth of stone archways and small, forgotten rooms, smelling strongly of earth. Ace, who had been trotting ahead, suddenly stopped in the middle of a large open area. He began to sniff intently at the base of a long, solid wall built of massive, fitted stones. It looked no different from any other wall in the cellar. But Ace was fixated. He let out a soft whine, pressing his nose against the cool stone. He looked back at John, then back at the wall. Then he did something he rarely did. He lifted a paw and gently, deliberately, scratched at the mortar between two of the largest stones near the floor. "Ace, come on! There's nothing there, boy," John said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. But Ace ignored him. He scratched again, more insistently this time, his claws making a soft scraping sound. He was trying to tell him something. John sighed and walked over, crouching down beside his dog. He ran the beam of the flashlight over the wall. The stones were seamless, the mortar old and hard. He knocked on the surface. It felt solid. Yet Ace was adamant. He nudged John's hand with his nose and then looked pointedly at the spot he had been scratching. John trusted his dog. He had trusted him in situations where his life depended on it. He ran his fingers over the rough mortar, a strange feeling of anticipation beginning to stir within him. The wall was cold and solid, but Ace's behavior was a clear signal. Something was hidden here, and his quiet uncle's legacy had just become a profound and dangerous mystery. The cellar remained cold and silent, the beam of John's flashlight the only thing disturbing the ancient darkness. Ace stayed pressed against the stone wall, his conviction unwavering. John ran his hands over the surface one last time. It was solid, impenetrable. Whatever his dog sensed was buried deep, sealed behind a barrier that brute force alone couldn't breach. For now, this was a dead end. "All right, boy, let's go," John said, his voice low. "If there's a way in, it's not here." Ace let out a reluctant whine but obeyed, trotting up the stone steps behind John, casting one last look back at the mysterious wall. Back in the dusty grandeur of the main house, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, painting long, distorted shadows across the floors. The discovery in the cellar, combined with the signs of recent visitors, had fundamentally changed John's mission. This was no longer about a quick assessment and a sale. It was about solving a puzzle. His Uncle Augustus hadn't just left him a house, he had left him a mystery. Driven by a new sense of purpose, John began a more methodical search of the manor. He was no longer just a curious inheritor, he was a soldier on reconnaissance. He moved from room to room, his eyes scanning for anything out of place, any detail that didn't fit with the narrative of decades-long neglect. Ace stayed close, a silent gray shadow at his heels. On the second floor, in a long hallway, lined with faded, water-stained portraits of stern-faced ancestors, he found it. Tucked away at the very end of the hall was a massive, moth-eaten tapestry depicting a hunting scene. It was dark, grim, and covered in a thick layer of dust. While the other walls were bare stone or crumbling plaster, this tapestry seemed deliberately placed to conceal something. He grabbed the heavy fabric at the bottom and pulled. It came away from the wall with a ripping sound and a cloud of choking dust, revealing a small, unassuming wooden door set low in the stone. It was barely 5 feet high, made of dark, heavy planks. But it was the lock that made John's breath catch in his throat. Unlike the ancient rusted iron hardware on every other door in the manor, this one was fitted with a modern, high-security deadbolt. It was sleek, made of stainless steel, and looked completely alien against the centuries-old wood. Its presence was a glaring contradiction, a clear and undeniable sign that someone had been here in recent decades, not as a squatter, but as someone with a secret to protect. This was it. This had to be connected to the secret in the cellar. John tried the ornate key from the front door, knowing it wouldn't work. He jiggled the handle, but it was solid. This door was not meant to be opened easily. As John was crouched, examining the lock, Ace suddenly stiffened. The fur on his neck bristled, and a low, almost inaudible growl escaped his throat. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking down the long hallway, toward the grand staircase. John rose silently, every sense on high alert. He heard it, too, the crunch of gravel from the driveway outside, followed by the purr of a high-end car engine, a sound far too smooth and quiet for this rugged country. A moment later, a car door shut with a solid, expensive thud. "Stay," John whispered to Ace, his voice a quiet command. He moved swiftly and silently back toward the foyer, keeping to the shadows of the hallway. He peered down from the top of the staircase. A man was standing in the open doorway, framed by the fading light. He wasn't a local. The visitor was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the decay surrounding him. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with silvering dark hair swept back from his forehead and a handsome, clean-shaven face. He carried himself with an air of effortless confidence and authority, his polished leather shoes looking absurdly out of place on the dusty stone floor. This was Victor Kane. "Hello?" Victor called out, his voice smooth and cultured. It echoed slightly in the vast, empty space. "Is anyone here? I was told a Mr. Miller had taken possession of the property." John descended the stairs slowly, his worn work boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the creaking wood. He did not try to hide his presence. In his experience, confronting a potential threat head-on was often the best strategy. Ace remained at the top of the stairs, a silent, watchful sentinel. Victor Kane turned, and a perfectly calibrated, friendly smile appeared on his face. His eyes, however, were a cool, calculating gray. They took in John's rugged appearance, the plaid shirt, the worn jeans, the beard, with a flicker of something that might have been amusement or disdain. "Mr. Miller, I presume?" Victor said, extending a hand. "A pleasure. My name is Victor Kane." John took the offered hand. Victor's grip was firm but manicured, the hand of a man who had never known a day of hard labor. "What can I do for you, Mr. Kane?" John asked, his tone neutral. "Please, call me Victor. I know this is sudden, but I happened to be in the area on business and heard that Blackwood had finally passed to a new owner. I hope I'm not intruding." "You're a long way from anywhere to just be in the area," John stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Victor's smile didn't waver. A fair point. To be direct, my company, Kane Solutions, specializes in the acquisition and restoration of historic properties. I've had my eye on this magnificent place for years. It's a tragedy to see it in such a state. He gestured around the decaying foyer. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer, say $500,000, cash. We can have the paperwork drawn up by the end of the week. It would save you the headache of dealing with this project. The offer was substantial, enough to change a life. It was also far too much for a derelict property in the middle of nowhere. It was a clear sign of desperation. John's eyes remained steady on Victor's. I'm not looking to sell. A flicker of annoyance crossed Victor's face before being smoothed over by his polished veneer. Of course, I understand the sentimental attachment, but you must be practical. The cost to make this place habitable would be astronomical. My offer is more than fair. It's not about the money, John said simply. Victor sighed, a theatrical display of patience. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Mr. Miller, perhaps you don't understand. My family has had an interest in this land for a very long time. It holds a certain historical significance for us. We would be most grateful to see it return to what we consider its proper stewardship. The words hung in the air, a veiled threat wrapped in a polite request. The implication was clear. This was not just business. This was personal. I'll think about it, John said, a classic military response for ending a conversation without conceding ground. Do, Victor said, his smile returning, though it no longer reached his cold eyes. He pulled a slim, elegant business card from his suit pocket. My personal number? Call me when you come to your senses. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. He looked back at John, his expression hardening for just a moment. But don't think for too long. Some histories are best left undisturbed. With that final ominous remark, he was gone. The sound of his luxury car starting up and driving away felt like a violation of the sacred quiet. John stood motionless in the foyer for a long time, the expensive business card feeling cold and foreign in his hand. Ace trotted down the stairs and nudged his leg, letting out a soft whine. The visit had confirmed everything. The watchers, the modern lock, the exorbitant offer, the veiled threat. Victor Kane wanted something inside this house, something he was willing to pay a fortune for, or perhaps take by other means. John looked up the grand staircase toward the hallway with the hidden door. His decision was made. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was staying. Whatever secret Blackwood Manor held, he was now its guardian, and he would not abandon his post. The first rays of dawn crept through the grimy windows of Blackwood Manor, casting a pale, ethereal light on the decaying grandeur of the foyer. John had not slept. He had spent the night in a dusty armchair, a heavy tire iron resting by his side, while Ace lay at the bottom of the staircase, a vigilant, unmoving shadow. The presence of Victor Kane had transformed the house from a place of mystery into a potential battlefield. And on a battlefield, information was ammunition. As the sun climbed higher, John knew he couldn't stay locked inside. He needed supplies, and more importantly, he needed knowledge. Kane's words about his family's historical significance to the land were a clue, and John intended to follow it. "Watch the house, boy," John said, giving Ace a firm pat on the head. "I'll be back." Ace whined softly but seemed to understand, settling back into his guard post as John headed out to his truck. The drive into the nearest town, a small picturesque village named Havenwood, took 20 minutes. It was a classic Vermont town with a white-steepled church, a town green, and a single main street lined with brick buildings that had stood for over a century. His first stop was the town's only grocery store, a place called Henderson's Mercantile that seemed to sell a little bit of everything. An old-fashioned bell chimed as he opened the door. The man behind the counter, presumably Mr. Henderson, was a portly, cheerful-looking man in his 60s with a fringe of white hair and a friendly smile. "Morning," the man chirped. "Don't see many new faces around here. Passing through?" "Something like that," John replied, grabbing a basket. "I need a few things. Some canned goods, coffee, dog food." "Sure thing. Aisle 2 for the people food, end of aisle 3 for the four-legged kind," Mr. Henderson said, his eyes full of friendly curiosity. Staying long? John decided a direct approach was best in a town this small. "I'm staying out at the old Blackwood place. It belonged to my great-uncle." Henderson's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be. Augustus Miller's boy?" We all wondered who'd end up with that old place. Most folks around here wouldn't go near it after dark. "Say it's haunted." John gave a non-committal shrug. "Haven't met any ghosts yet, but I did have a visitor yesterday, a man named Victor Kane." The shopkeeper's cheerful demeanor vanished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You be careful with that one. His company, Kane Solutions, has been trying to buy up land all over the county. But he's been especially interested in Blackwood, been sniffing around for years, sent lawyers, surveyors, the whole 9 yards. Augustus never would sell." "Any idea why?" John asked, pausing with a can of beans in his hand. "Never said, but the old manor has history," Henderson continued, warming to the topic. "Big history. During the war, the second one, the government took it over. Fences went up, military trucks, day and night, top secret stuff. My father used to say they were doing some kind of research up there. After 1945, the soldiers left, and the place has been empty ever since." The information clicked into place. A secret military project? It fit. "Thanks," John said, his voice sincere. "That's helpful." After paying for his supplies, John's next stop was the town library, a small brick building next to the post office. Inside, he found a treasure trove of local history meticulously organized by a helpful, elderly librarian. He spent the next 2 hours scrolling through microfilmed archives of the local newspaper from the 1940s. The articles confirmed what Henderson had said. In 1942, Blackwood Manor was officially requisitioned by the War Department for a project codenamed Operation Aegis. The details were sparse, citing national security. There were photos of military vehicles on the manor's driveway and mentions of scientific personnel being brought in. Then, in late 1945, a brief article announced the project's conclusion and the return of the property to the Miller family. After that, nothing. It was as if the manor and whatever had happened within its walls had been deliberately forgotten. Armed with this new knowledge, John drove to a scenic overlook just outside of town, where he finally got a clear cell signal. He dialed the number for the lawyer, Mr. Davies. The lawyer picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Miller, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Have you had a chance to see the property?" "I've seen it," John said, his voice flat. "And I've had a visitor. Victor Kane offered me $500,000 for it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Davies let out a heavy sigh. "I was afraid of that. Augustus warned me they would likely come sniffing around as soon as they heard of his passing." "My uncle knew about Kane?" "He knew about the Kane family, yes. He also knew what they were after," Davies said. "John, I need to be frank with you. Your uncle didn't choose you to inherit Blackwood by accident. He was very specific in his instructions to me." "Why me?" John asked, the question that had been nagging him from the start. "Because you were a ranger," the lawyer said, his voice firm and clear. "Augustus knew. He followed your career from a distance. He spent the better part of his life researching the manor's history, piecing together what happened there during the war. He found evidence that something of immense value was hidden there, something the government never recovered. But his health failed him in his later years. He was a scholar, not an explorer. He couldn't get through the final door, so to speak." Davies' voice took on a new urgency. "He told me, the answer isn't just in a book, Davies. It's in the stone. It's a puzzle for a soldier. He believed that only the training, the perseverance, and the practiced eye of a man like you could solve the final mystery. He trusted you to finish what he started." The words hit John with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a burden. It was a legacy. A mission passed from one generation to the next. The quiet academic uncle had seen the soldier in him, not as a broken man to be pitied, but as a skilled operator uniquely qualified for a task. For the first time in a long time, John felt a flicker of the pride he used to have in his uniform. "I understand," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Be careful, son," the lawyer warned. "If what Augustus believed is true, you're not just sitting on a piece of real estate, you're guarding a treasure." After hanging up, John sat in his truck for a long time, staring out at the rolling green hills of Vermont. The pieces were all there: a secret wartime project, a hidden treasure, and a powerful family desperate to claim it. His path was clear. When he arrived back at the manor, Ace greeted him with a frantic, happy dance. John knelt and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck. "Looks like we're not leaving, boy," he murmured into Ace's soft fur. "This is our post now." That afternoon, they began to fortify their position. John brought in his meager supplies from the truck: a sleeping bag, a cooler, his coffee pot, and Ace's food. He chose a small defensible room on the ground floor just off the main kitchen. It had a sturdy door, a large fireplace for warmth, and only one window, which he promptly boarded up from the inside. As the sun set, casting a final golden glow on the dark stones of the manor, John felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. He had a purpose. He had a mission. He and Ace were no longer just visitors. They were home. The days at Blackwood Manor settled into a new rhythm, a routine born of caution and purpose. John and Ace were no longer just occupying the space. They were inhabiting it, transforming a corner of the decaying house into a functional, if Spartan, base of operations. Their world shrank to the stone walls of the manor and the whispering woods that surrounded it. Mornings began before sunrise. John would rekindle the embers in the large fireplace of their chosen room, the crackle of the flames a comforting sound against the deep silence of the house. While the old percolator sputtered on a grate over the fire, filling the air with the rich aroma of coffee, he and Ace would conduct their first patrol of the day. They moved as a single unit, a silent team navigating the misty grounds. John's eyes would scan for any disturbance, broken twigs, fresh tracks, while Ace's nose constantly tested the air, his ears swiveling to catch the faintest sound. During the day, John worked. His first priority had been security. Drawing on his ranger training, he had established a simple but effective perimeter alarm system. He used thin, nearly invisible fishing line, strung low to the ground at key entry points around the manor, each connected to a small stack of empty tin cans that would rattle at the slightest touch. It was a low-tech solution, but it would provide a crucial warning. His primary focus, however, was the small, locked door on the second floor. It was the gateway to the manor's secret, and it taunted him with its modern, impenetrable lock. He knew brute force was not the answer. His uncle's message had been clear. This was a puzzle for a soldier. This meant he needed more intelligence. He turned his attention to the library. Though most of the books had been ruined by dampness, the room itself felt like the heart of his uncle's research. For 2 days, he methodically searched it, tapping walls, checking for loose floorboards, and examining the large oak desk that sat like a forgotten monarch in the center of the room. It was on the 3rd day that he found it. Tucked away in a false bottom of a deep desk drawer, hidden beneath a layer of moldy stationery, was a thin, leather-bound notebook. It was his great-great-grandfather's journal. The pages were filled with the elegant, looping script of a bygone era. Much of it was mundane: notes on crop rotations, details of the manor's construction, observations on the weather. But interspersed with these entries were pages of complex diagrams, mathematical formulas, and notes on a surprising topic: military cryptography. John sat on the floor of the dusty library, the journal open in his lap, a sense of awe washing over him. His ancestor, the man who had transported this castle, stone by stone, had been more than a wealthy eccentric. He had been a keen intellect with a deep interest in the art of secrets. The journal contained detailed analyses of ciphers used during the American Civil War and the First World War. Then, in a section dated early 1942, John found what he was looking for. There was a detailed entry on emerging military coordinate ciphers, systems used to pass secret locations and instructions. His ancestor had written, "The most elegant secret is not one that requires a key, but one that requires the right perspective. The lock and the key can be one and the same if one knows how to look." Beside the entry was a hand-drawn sketch. It showed a circular dial marked with degrees and cardinal directions, nearly identical to the strange, star-like markings surrounding the keyhole on the hidden door. It wasn't a keyhole. It was a combination lock, a dial disguised as decoration. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him. He now understood the mechanism, but he still needed the combination. He spent the rest of the day and a long, frustrating evening poring over the journal, searching for a sequence of numbers, a date, anything that could serve as the code. The text was dense, his ancestors' thoughts often meandering and philosophical. As the hours wore on and the fire in their small room burned low, a familiar tension began to build in John's shoulders. The frustration felt like a wall closing in. He leaned his head back against the stone, closing his eyes. A wet nose nudged his hand. He looked down to see Ace staring up at him, his intelligent brown eyes full of concern. The dog rested his heavy head on John's knee, letting out a soft, low sigh, as if to say, "It's all right. I'm here." The simple, unconditional support was enough to break the spell of his frustration. John stroked Ace's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. "You're right, boy," he whispered, "one step at a time." The silent reassurance from his companion was all the encouragement he needed. The outside world, however, was not content to leave them in peace. The subtle signs of surveillance began to escalate. It started with a dark green SUV he saw parked for over an hour at the turnoff to the Manor's private road. When John and Ace had approached in the truck, it had sped off with a spray of gravel. A few days later, while on patrol, Ace found fresh footprints near the woods at the back of the property, as if someone had been observing the house from a distance. The threat became undeniable on a cold, drizzly afternoon. The old cell phone John kept charged for emergencies buzzed to life. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? John, it's George Henderson from the Mercantile down in town." The shopkeeper's voice was low and worried. "Listen, I don't want to be a busybody, but I thought you should know. Two fellas were just in here, not locals. They were the rough sort, asking questions." John's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of questions?" "They were asking about you, about the fella who took over the old Miller place. Wanted to know if you were living up there alone, if you received many visitors. I told them I didn't know anything, but they had a look about them I didn't like. Just thought you should be on your guard." "I appreciate that, George." "Thank you," John said, his voice grim. The call confirmed his fears. Victor Kane was done with polite offers. He was gathering intelligence, probing for weaknesses. The clock was ticking. That night, as a storm raged outside, battering the old manor with wind and rain, John sat before the hidden door once more. The journal was open beside him, his flashlight casting a focused beam on the intricate dial. He no longer saw it as a barrier, but as a map left by a soldier of a different era. And with Ace lying faithfully at his feet, a warm and steady presence in the cold, dark hallway, he began to work. The storm outside raged with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of Blackwood Manor. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the eaves like a mournful spirit. Inside the long, dark hallway of the second floor, the only sounds were the distant thunder and the soft rustle of John turning the brittle pages of his great-great-grandfather's journal. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the flashlight a pool of focused light in the oppressive darkness. Ace lay beside him, a warm, solid presence whose occasional sigh was a comforting counterpoint to the storm's chaos. For hours, John had been lost in the past, trying to decipher the final piece of the puzzle. He understood the mechanism. The dial around the lock was a coordinate cipher, but the combination, the specific sequence of numbers and directions, remained elusive. He reread the key passage for the 10th time, his finger tracing the elegant script. The most elegant secret is not one that requires a key, but one that requires the right perspective. The lock and the key can be one and the same if one knows how to look. He had assumed his ancestor was speaking metaphorically about the door's lock, but as the night wore on and his frustration mounted, the words began to take on a new, more literal meaning. What if he wasn't just talking about the lock? What if he was also talking about the key? John set the journal aside and picked up the large, ornate key that had opened the front door. It felt heavy and substantial in his hand. He ran his thumb over the handle. It was decorated with the Miller family crest, a simple design of an oak tree and a star. At its center was a beautifully detailed 8-pointed compass rose, its brass worn smooth by time. He had dismissed it as mere decoration. "The lock and the key can be one," he whispered, his own words barely audible above the storm. He felt a sudden, electric jolt of understanding, a moment of clarity so intense it felt like a voice speaking to him across the decades. He wasn't just solving a puzzle, he was in a dialogue with his ancestor. The man who had designed this secret was guiding him, leaving a trail of intellectual breadcrumbs for a mind that thought like his. He felt a profound connection to the man, a shared sense of purpose that transcended time. With renewed focus, John examined the compass rose on the key. It was a perfect miniature version of the dial on the door. He turned it over and over in the flashlight beam. It seemed solid, a single piece of carved brass. But his training had taught him to look for the seams, the subtle imperfections that betray a hidden mechanism. He ran the edge of his thumbnail around the base of the compass rose and found it, a hairline crack, almost invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't just decoration, it was a device. His heart began to pound a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He returned to the journal, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through the pages. If the key was part of the lock, then the combination must be in the journal, hidden in plain sight. He scanned the entries from 1942, looking for a sequence, a set of coordinates. He found lists of numbers related to construction costs, dates of meetings, and astronomical observations. None of them seemed right. He leaned back, frustration returning. He had the what, but not the how. Ace, sensing his master's tension, lifted his head and let out a soft whine, nudging John's hand with his wet nose. "I know, boy. I'm missing something," John murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. He closed his eyes, clearing his mind, trying to think like his ancestor. A soldier, a cryptographer. He wouldn't use something obvious like a birthday. He would use something significant, something tied to the mission itself. His eyes snapped open. Operation Aegis. He flipped back to the section of the journal where his ancestor mentioned the government project. The entry was dated October 2nd, 1942. His ancestor had written, "Today, the Manor officially serves a new purpose. The Aegis is in place. May it shield the light from the coming darkness. October 2nd, 1942. 10:02, 1942. Could it be that simple? A sequence of numbers. He looked back at the compass rose. It was marked with cardinal directions, N, S, E, W, and degrees. The numbers alone weren't enough. He needed directions. He read the sentence again. May it shield the light from the coming darkness. It sounded poetic, but maybe it was more. Light, darkness, east to west, sunrise to sunset. What if the combination was tied to that idea? He looked at the date again. 10:02, 42. He experimented in his mind. 10 degrees east, 2 degrees south, 42 degrees west. It was a sequence, a path. With trembling fingers, he held the key firmly and pressed down on the center of the compass rose. Nothing happened. He then tried turning the outer ring. It moved, clicking softly with each degree. He aligned the first number, turning the dial until a small notch lined up with 10 degrees on the east side. Then he aligned the second, 2 degrees south. And finally, the third, 42 degrees west. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, with a soft, satisfying click, the entire compass rose popped up slightly. John's breath hitched. He carefully lifted the small brass cap. Nestled inside the hollowed-out handle of the large key was another, smaller key. It was modern, made of steel, perfectly matching the high-security lock on the hidden door. "Yes," John breathed out, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. Ace, sensing the shift from tense concentration to victory, sprang to his feet. He let out a single, sharp bark and began wagging his tail, his entire body wriggling with shared excitement. John laughed, a real hearty laugh that echoed in the hallway, and pulled the dog into a rough embrace. "We did it, boy! We did it!" After a moment of celebration, John grabbed the flashlight and the newly discovered key. They made their way back to the hidden door. The air in the hallway felt charged with anticipation. He inserted the small key into the modern lock. It slid in perfectly, but he knew that wasn't enough. He looked at the dial surrounding the keyhole. Now for the final step. He placed his fingers on the outer ring of the lock's dial, its cool metal a stark contrast to his warm skin. He meticulously entered the same combination he had used on the key. 10 degrees east. Click. 2 degrees south. Click. 42 degrees west. Click. He held his breath and turned the small key. There was a loud metallic clunk as the deadbolt retracted. For the first time in what was likely half a century, the lock was open. John pulled the key out and grasped the simple iron handle on the door. He pulled. The door swung inward with a low, groaning protest, the sound of ancient wood moving against stone. A wave of cool, stale air rushed out to meet them, carrying the scent of dust, old paper, and something else, the faint metallic tang of sealed-away secrets. John shone the flashlight into the opening. The beam cut through the absolute darkness, but was swallowed by it, revealing nothing but the top of a steep, narrow staircase descending into the blackness below. The vault was open. The past was waiting. The air that rose from the darkness below was cold and completely still, a pocket of time that had been sealed for more than half a century. John stood at the threshold, the beam of his flashlight cutting a sharp, lonely path down the steep stone staircase. Beside him, Ace let out a low, questioning whine, his body poised and alert. He looked up at John, his eyes seeking reassurance. "It's okay, boy," John said, his voice a low rumble that was quickly swallowed by the silence. "Let's go see what we've found." With Ace following so closely he was practically touching John's leg, they descended into the vault. The stone steps were narrow and perfectly cut, a testament to the care and precision with which this place had been built. After about 20 steps, they reached the bottom, stepping onto a smooth, concrete floor. John swept the flashlight beam across the space, and his breath caught in his chest. This was no simple cellar room. It was a purpose-built, climate-controlled vault, roughly 30 feet square, with thick, insulated walls. Along two of the walls were rows of tall, gray, military-style filing cabinets. The other two walls were stacked high with large wooden crates of various sizes, each stenciled with a series of numbers and the words, Project Aegis. The sheer scale of it was staggering. This was not the work of one man hiding a few personal treasures. This was a professional, clandestine operation. The air smelled of old canvas, dry paper, and the faint, clean scent of preservative oils. Ace began to sniff the perimeter of the room, his paws making no sound on the smooth floor. He seemed calm, his initial tension replaced by a focused curiosity. John, meanwhile, felt a growing sense of reverence and trepidation. He was standing in a place that history had forgotten. He approached the nearest stack of crates, his flashlight beam dancing over the stenciled markings. He found a small crowbar in a toolkit, left against one wall, another sign of his ancestors' meticulous planning. With a groan of protesting wood, he pried the lid off the first crate. Inside, nestled in a bed of straw and thick, oil-treated canvas, was a large, ornately framed painting. John carefully lifted it out. Even in the harsh beam of the flashlight, the colors were breathtakingly vibrant. It was an impressionist landscape, a field of sunflowers under a swirling blue sky. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, even to his untrained eye. Monet. He stared at it, his mind struggling to comprehend the reality of what he was holding. He gently set it against the wall and opened another crate, and then another. A portrait by Rembrandt, its subject's eyes seeming to follow him from the shadows. A delicate watercolor of ballet dancers by Degas. A still life so vivid he could almost smell the fruit. It was a king's ransom, a private museum hidden from the world. After a long, dizzying hour of uncovering masterpiece after masterpiece, John turned his attention to the filing cabinets. The treasure here, he suspected, was not of gold or canvas, but of truth. The drawers slid open with a smooth metallic whisper, the mechanisms perfectly preserved in the dry air. The first cabinet was filled with provenance documents, bills of sale, and insurance appraisals for every piece of art in the room. His ancestor had kept meticulous records. It was in the second cabinet under the label Aegis Correspondence that he found the heart of the mystery. He pulled out a thick file. The cover page was stamped with a red, faded top secret. It contained the official charter for Operation Aegis, a joint venture between the U.S. government and a consortium of private collectors and museums. The mission, as he had suspected, was to safeguard irreplaceable works of art from the threat of Nazi looting in the event of an invasion or widespread destruction. Blackwood Manor had been chosen for its remote location and solid construction. It was one of several such secret repositories across the country. But it was a thin, personal folder at the very back of the drawer that held the darkest secret. It contained only a few pages, written not on an official typewriter, but in his great-great-grandfather's own hand. It was an unsent letter, a draft addressed to the War Department, dated November 1945. John sat on the cold concrete floor, Ace immediately coming to rest his head on his knee, and began to read. "To whom it may concern," the letter began. "While I have complied with all directives to return the assets of Project Aegis to their listed owners, I must formally protest and refuse the transfer of 12 specific pieces. My research has proven beyond any doubt that the documents of ownership provided for these works have been expertly forged. The man claiming them, Mr. Alistair Kane, is not their rightful owner." John's blood ran cold. Kane. "Mr. Kane," the letter continued, "has presented himself as an agent for European families displaced by the war. In truth, he is a war profiteer, a collaborator who used the chaos of the conflict to acquire assets stolen from Jewish families who perished in the camps. The evidence is enclosed. To return these masterpieces to him would be to sanction his theft and desecrate the memory of their true owners. I cannot, in good conscience, be a party to such a monstrous injustice. I have therefore secured these 12 pieces in a location known only to me. They will remain there until such a time as their true lineage can be found, or until a more just authority prevails. I will protect them with my life, if necessary." It was all there. A crime, a cover-up, and a solemn vow from a man of honor. His great-great-grandfather had stood against the powerful Kane family, and in doing so, had created a feud that had simmered for generations. Victor Kane wasn't just after money, he was after the evidence that would expose his family's criminal origins. John felt the weight of it all settle upon him. This was no longer just his uncle's legacy, it was his great-great-grandfather's. He was the last guard at this post, the inheritor of a sacred duty. His military training took over, pushing aside the wave of emotion. He was in a compromised position, holding intelligence the enemy would kill for. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. He pulled out his cell phone. The signal was non-existent this deep underground. Cursing under his breath, he gathered the most crucial documents, his ancestor's letter, the list of the 12 contested paintings, and the forged ownership papers. With Ace at his heels, he climbed the stairs back into the main house. He went to a window on the second floor where he knew the signal was strongest. He quickly and methodically took clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page. He backed them up to a secure cloud service he still maintained from his time in service. The evidence was now safe, duplicated, and off-site. With that done, he made one more call. He scrolled through his contacts to a name he hadn't called in over a year. Done. The phone rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Miller, don't tell me you're calling to wish me a happy birthday. Not yet, Dunn. I'm calling in a marker, John said, his voice low and serious. Marcus Dunn had been his second in command, a man he trusted implicitly, now a special agent with the FBI's art crime team. I'm listening. Dunn's voice lost its joking tone. I'm in Vermont. I've come into possession of some sensitive historical property. And it's attracting the wrong kind of attention, John said, choosing his words carefully. He couldn't risk saying more over an open line. The situation is contained for now, but it could escalate. I need you to be ready. There was a pause. Dunn knew him well enough not to ask unnecessary questions. He knew John would never make a call like this unless it was serious. Understood. Send me your location. I'll put a pin in it and keep a team on informal standby. You give the word, we roll. Good. Hopefully it won't come to that, John said. It always comes to that with you, Miller, Dunn replied, but there was a note of respect in his voice. Watch your six. John ended the call, a small measure of relief washing over him. He had secured the evidence and alerted a trusted asset. He was no longer completely alone. He looked down at Ace, who had been sitting patiently by his feet the entire time. Now, John said, stroking the dog's head, we wait, and we prepare. The hours after the call to Dunn stretched into a tense, watchful silence. The adrenaline from the discovery in the vault slowly subsided, replaced by the cold, familiar calm of a soldier waiting for contact. John did not rest. He and Ace moved through the darkened manor like ghosts, preparing their defense. He relocked the vault and the hidden door, leaving the secrets of the past sealed away once more. He reinforced the main entry points, wedging heavy, broken furniture against the doors. He checked his makeshift alarms, ensuring the tin cans were perfectly balanced. He was not creating a fortress to win a war, but a maze designed to slow down, confuse, and delay an intruder. His goal was not to defeat the enemy, but to outlast them. Ace seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He stayed glued to John's side, his usual playful energy replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He would periodically stop, his head cocked, his ears twitching at the sounds of the old house settling, his senses a far more sophisticated alarm system than any John could devise. The attack came just after 2 a.m, under the cover of a moonless, overcast sky. It started not with a bang, but with a faint metallic rattle from the east side of the house. John, who had been sitting in the darkness of the main kitchen, was on his feet in an instant. Ace was already there, standing at the door, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. It was the sound of the alarm on the far side of the property, near the overgrown gardens. They weren't trying the front door. They were being tactical. "Easy, boy," John whispered, placing a calming hand on Ace's back. He moved to a dirty window that overlooked the gardens. Peering through a crack in the boarded-up frame, he saw them. 4 figures, dressed in dark clothing, moving with practiced efficiency. They had bypassed the main drive and cut through the woods. One of them carried a heavy-duty bolt cutter. They were not here to negotiate. John backed away from the window, his mind racing through the layout of the house. They would likely try a side entrance or a ground-floor window. He needed to draw them in, control their movement, and buy time. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth. With Ace at his heels, he crept up the grand staircase to the 2nd floor. He positioned himself in the shadows of the long hallway, the same hallway that hid the secret door. From here, he had a commanding view of the foyer and the main corridors leading from either side of the house. Minutes later, he heard the sharp, splintering crack of a window frame giving way on the ground floor, followed by the faint crunch of glass. They were in. He heard their hushed voices below, confident and professional. They fanned out, their flashlight beams cutting sharp, nervous patterns across the dusty air. "Find him," a voice commanded, low and authoritative. It was Victor Kane. He was here himself. This was more than just a job for his men. It was personal. John waited, his breathing slow and even. He needed to separate them, to turn the size of the house from a liability into an advantage. He looked at Ace, who was watching him intently, awaiting a command. He pointed toward the far end of the hallway, toward the west wing of the house. "Go, Ace. Speak," he whispered, his command barely audible. Ace understood. He moved like a gray shadow down the long corridor, his paws silent on the dusty floorboards. When he reached the far end, he let out a series of deep, ferocious barks that echoed through the entire manor. Down below, the intruders froze. "He's upstairs! West wing!" one of the men shouted. John heard two sets of footsteps break away from the main group, pounding up a secondary staircase in the west wing, drawn toward the sound of the dog. It was the opening he needed. While they were distracted, John moved. He crept back down the main staircase, the skillet held ready. He didn't engage. He just needed to create another problem for them to solve. In the massive, forgotten ballroom, he located the ropes for the heavy velvet curtains that covered the towering windows. With a few quick slashes from his utility knife, he weakened the supports. He then moved into the library. He placed the heavy skillet on a high shelf, balanced precariously over the doorway. It was a simple, non-lethal trap. He heard the men from the west wing returning, cursing in frustration. The dog's gone. It's like it vanished. As they regrouped in the foyer with Kane, John slipped back up the main staircase to his previous position. Now was the time for the main event. He took a deep breath and, with all his strength, shoved a massive, dust-shrouded china cabinet that stood at the top of the stairs. It tipped, teetered for a heart-stopping moment, and then crashed down the grand staircase with a cataclysmic roar of splintering wood and shattering porcelain. It landed at the bottom, completely blocking the main ascent, a barricade of shattered history. Chaos erupted below. The men shouted in alarm, their flashlights whipping around wildly. "He's up there! He's trapped!" one of them yelled. "Spread out! Find another way up! Now!" Kane commanded, his voice tight with fury. It was exactly what John wanted. They were now reacting to him, not the other way around. He had seized the initiative. He and Ace disappeared into the labyrinthine corridors of the second floor. For the next 15 minutes, John played a deadly game of cat and mouse. He used the house itself as his weapon. He threw a loose stone down a dumbwaiter shaft, creating a loud crash in the kitchen. He used his knowledge of the creaky floorboards to move silently while his pursuers made a racket. He led them on a chase through rooms that hadn't seen a human being in 50 years. He was a phantom, always one step ahead, his only goal to keep the clock ticking. The end came suddenly. John was hiding in a small linen closet, listening to the footsteps of two of Kane's men moving down the hallway when he heard a new sound. It was the distant but unmistakable wail of sirens, growing rapidly closer. Down below, Kane heard it too. A string of furious curses echoed up from the foyer. They called the cops. "Everyone out, back to the vehicle now." But it was too late. Powerful, professional floodlights suddenly blasted through the manor's windows, bathing the dust-filled interior in a brilliant, unforgiving white light. A voice, amplified by a megaphone, boomed through the night, a voice John knew well. "This is the FBI. The property is surrounded. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands in the air." It was done. He had made it. From his hiding spot, John heard the clatter of metal as weapons were dropped on the stone floor. The fight was over. He leaned his head back against the wall, a wave of profound relief washing over him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. He stayed hidden until he heard Dunn's team sweep the house, their calm, professional voices calling out, "Clear," room by room. When they finally reached his hallway, he stepped out of the closet, his hands raised. An agent immediately leveled his weapon at him before recognition dawned. "Miller?" Dunn appeared a moment later, his tactical vest stretched over a rumpled suit. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. He took in the scene, the barricaded staircase, the general chaos, and a slow grin spread across his face. "It always comes to that with you, Miller," he said, shaking his head. He looked down at Ace, who had emerged from the shadows to stand by John's side. "And you always have to make a mess." John just nodded, too exhausted to speak. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around Ace, burying his face in the dog's thick, comforting fur. They had held the line. The legacy was safe. The first light of dawn was breaking over the green mountains, painting the sky in soft hues of gray and rose. But the tranquil beauty of the morning stood in stark contrast to the scene at Blackwood Manor. The grounds, once silent and forgotten, were now a hive of activity, swarming with FBI agents, state troopers, and forensic technicians. The flashing lights of their vehicles cast a rhythmic, otherworldly glow on the ancient stone walls. John sat on the back of his pickup truck, a thick wool blanket draped over his shoulders, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Ace sat faithfully at his feet, his head resting on John's boot, a silent and comforting presence. John had spent the last 3 hours giving his official statement to Dunn, recounting every detail from the moment he had received the lawyer's letter to the final, chaotic moments of the standoff. He had handed over his great-great-grandfather's journal and the digital copies of the documents from the vault. The weight of the secret, a burden he had carried alone, was finally being lifted. Dunn walked over, his face etched with exhaustion, but also a deep satisfaction. "The preliminary report on the art is in," he said, his voice low. "The experts are calling it one of the most significant recoveries of WWE-era art on U.S. soil. You weren't just guarding a treasure, Miller. You were guarding a piece of history." Victor Kane and his men had been taken away in unmarked vehicles hours ago. Their professional silence had broken under federal interrogation. They were mercenaries, hired by Kane to secure the contents of the vault by any means necessary. For them, it was a job. For Kane, it had been an obsession. "What happens now?" John asked, his gaze fixed on the manor. "Now the wheels of justice turn," Dunn said. "We'll secure the vault and its contents as evidence. It's going to be a long process. Authentication, contacting museums, searching for the descendants of the original owners. As for the Kane family, their legacy is about to be rewritten." Dunn's prediction was an understatement. The story of the reclusive veteran, his loyal dog, and the hidden trove of Nazi-era art exploded into the national consciousness. News vans camped out at the end of the manor's long driveway. Headlines across the country screamed the tale: "Veteran and canine protect historic treasure," "The buried secret of Blackwood Manor," and most damningly, "Kane fortune built on lies. FBI uncovers decades of art theft." The evidence John had uncovered was irrefutable. The meticulously kept records of his great-great-grandfather, combined with the forged documents and the art itself, painted a clear picture of Alistair Kane's crimes. Victor Kane's desperate attempt to bury his family's past had, ironically, unearthed it for the entire world to see. Kane Solutions collapsed under the weight of the scandal, its assets frozen, its reputation destroyed. The months that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and historical discoveries. Art historians and conservators from around the world descended on Blackwood Manor, their hushed, reverent voices replacing the shouts of federal agents. John and Ace watched as the masterpieces were carefully cataloged, authenticated, and prepared for their final journeys home. One brisk autumn afternoon, a year after the raid, John stood on the porch as a small, elegant painting of a Parisian street scene was handed over to an elderly woman who had flown in from France. It had belonged to her grandfather, a gallery owner who had perished in the Holocaust. As she clutched the painting to her chest, her eyes filled with tears, she turned to John. "You have returned a piece of my soul," she said in heavily accented English. "My family is in your debt." It was in moments like these that John understood the true nature of the legacy he had inherited. It was never about the monetary value of the art. It was about restoring history, honoring memory, and correcting a profound injustice. For his role in the recovery and for safeguarding the art, John received substantial rewards from a consortium of grateful museums and insurance companies, finder's fees that amounted to a sum of money so large it felt unreal. His first act was not to buy a new truck or leave Vermont. It was to hire a team of the best historical restoration experts in New England. He was going to bring Blackwood Manor back to life. The town of Havenwood watched the transformation with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect. The crazy old soldier in the haunted house was now a local hero. Trucks carrying lumber, slate for the roof, and panes of custom-made glass became a common sight on the road to the manor. John insisted on hiring local craftsmen whenever possible, pumping money and life back into the community. George Henderson, the owner of the mercantile, often dropped by with supplies and local gossip, his earlier suspicion replaced by a proud, neighborly affection. One afternoon, as John was overseeing the careful restoration of the library's intricate woodwork, a dusty town police cruiser pulled up the driveway. The man who got out was Police Chief Brody, a burly, gray-haired man with a weathered face and a reputation for being a man of few words. He had been one of the first local officers on the scene the night of the raid. He walked up to John, his hands in his pockets. "Miller," he said with a gruff nod. "Chief," John replied, wiping his hands on a rag. Brody looked around at the restored stonework and the new roof. "Place is looking good. Not so haunted anymore." "We're getting there," John said. The chief was quiet for a moment, his gaze settling on Ace, who was lying in a patch of sun on the porch. "You know, when we first heard someone was squatting up here, I figured you were trouble. Another vet who couldn't leave the war behind." He looked John in the eye, a look of genuine respect in his weathered face. He extended a calloused hand. "I was wrong. You brought that war to its proper end. This town is proud to have you." John shook his hand, a simple gesture that meant more than all the newspaper articles combined. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of a community. With the manor's physical restoration well underway, John turned to its future. He used a significant portion of the reward money to establish the Aegis Legacy Foundation. Blackwood Manor would not be a private home. It would become a center for historical research, its library open to scholars studying art repatriation and the history of the Second World War. The vault, once a hidden tomb of secrets, was converted into a small private museum dedicated to the story of Operation Aegis. One crisp evening, John stood on the newly finished porch, a mug of coffee in his hands, looking out over the grounds. The setting sun cast a warm golden light on the manor, making the old stones glow. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. Ace came and sat beside him, leaning his weight against John's leg. John looked down at his loyal friend, the silent partner in this incredible journey. They had arrived here as two solitary souls, seeking peace and quiet. They had found a mission, a purpose, and a home. The manor was no longer a place to hide from the world, but a beacon of justice, a testament to the quiet courage of one man and the enduring power of truth. The legacy was safe, and a new one had just begun. 2 years passed, not in the blink of an eye, but as a series of deliberate, meaningful days. The seasons turned, painting the Vermont landscape in the vibrant greens of spring, the deep emeralds of summer, and the fiery palette of autumn. And with each passing season, Blackwood Manor healed. The house no longer stood as a grim, forgotten relic. It was alive. The dark, moss-covered stones had been cleaned, revealing a warm, welcoming gray. Sunlight, no longer impeded by grime and broken panes, streamed through immaculate windows, illuminating rooms filled not with dust and ghosts, but with purpose. The scent of decay had been replaced by the smell of lemon polish, old books, and freshly brewed coffee. Blackwood Manor was now the permanent home of the Aegis Legacy Foundation. Scholars, historians, and art students now walked the halls that John and Ace had once patrolled in tense silence. The grand library, its woodwork gleaming, was once again a sanctuary of knowledge. The small museum in the converted vault saw a steady stream of visitors by appointment, each leaving with a deeper understanding of a small, secret chapter of a great and terrible war. John's life had healed alongside the manor. He was no longer a recluse, but a custodian. He lived in a small private apartment that had been beautifully restored in the manor's east wing. He oversaw the Foundation's operations with a quiet competence that surprised no one more than himself. He was respected, not just as a hero, but as a thoughtful guardian of history. The most profound change, however, was one that no one else could see. It was the silence that now filled his nights. The nightmares, the twisted landscapes of sand and fire that had haunted his sleep for a decade, were gone. They had not been conquered in a single, violent battle, but had simply faded away, starved of the darkness and isolation in which they had thrived. He slept soundly now, a deep and dreamless sleep, with Ace snoring softly on a rug by his bed. The frantic, gasping awakenings, the cold sweat, the phantom weight of his body armor, they were all just memories, scars that no longer ached. One crisp October afternoon, John stood in the library watching a young graduate student who was hunched over a collection of documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was writing a thesis on the role of private citizens in wartime preservation. She was one of dozens who had come here to learn. He had provided them with the raw materials of history, and in turn, they had filled his home with life and purpose. He walked over to the large stone fireplace. Hanging above it was a newly framed portrait. It was not a priceless masterpiece, but a simple, amateur oil painting of the manor as it had looked in the early 20th century, painted by his great-great-grandfather. Next to it was a small faded photograph of his great-uncle Augustus, his kind, scholarly eyes seeming to look out with quiet approval. John looked at the faces of the two men who had so profoundly changed his life. He finally understood the true inheritance they had left him. The art, the money, the house, those were merely the vessels. The real legacy was the mission. They had given him a war he could win. Not a war of violence and survival, but one of honor, truth, and restoration. They had given him a reason to use his skills not to destroy, but to protect. In saving Blackwood Manor's secrets, he had, in the most unexpected way, saved himself. The mission had led him out of the wilderness of his own mind and back into the world. It had given him back a future he thought he had lost forever. Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, John walked out onto the newly built stone balcony that overlooked the sprawling grounds. The air was cool and clean. The trees that bordered the property were a blaze of autumn color. It was a scene of profound peace. A familiar, heavy body leaned against his leg. Ace was there, as he always was, his gray and white fur soft in the fading light. He was older now, his muzzle frosted with gray, his movements a little stiffer, but his eyes were as bright and intelligent as ever. He looked up at John, his tail giving a slow, contented thump against the stone. John rested his hand on the dog's broad head, his fingers absently stroking the soft fur behind his ears. They stood there together, in comfortable silence, two old soldiers who had found their final, peaceful posting. They had arrived at this place broken and adrift, a man haunted by his past, and a dog who had been his only anchor. They had faced down threats both seen and unseen, and together they had built a home. John's gaze drifted from the vibrant colors of the forest to the warm, inviting lights that now glowed from the manor's windows. He was no longer running. He was no longer hiding. He was a guardian, not of a treasure, but of a story of courage, integrity, and the enduring power of doing the right thing, no matter the cost. He had found his home, not just within the strong stone walls of Blackwood Manor, but in the quiet, steady peace that had finally settled in his own soul. He had everything he needed. "It's beautiful, isn't it, boy?" John said softly, his voice full of a quiet contentment he had once thought impossible. Ace looked out at the sunset, then back up at his master, and let out a soft, happy sigh. The legacy was safe, the future was bright, and they would face it together. John and Ace's journey teaches us a simple truth. The deepest wounds are often healed by the quiet loyalty of a friend who asks for nothing in return. It reminds us that the greatest legacies we can hope for are not treasures to be owned, but missions that give us purpose. If their story has found a place in your heart, we invite you to become part of our community by sharing your thoughts below. Every like, share, and subscription helps us to unearth more tales of courage and companionship. A new story is already waiting for you. Just click on the video now, appearing on your screen to continue the journey with us.